The first drop pod hit the tarmac of Halden's Reach 9 minutes ahead of schedule, and nobody shot at it. Overseer Callas Dren noticed this before anything else. He noticed it the way a man notices a held breath, a wrongness in the shape of silence. He had run the invasion timeline 41 times in simulation. 41 times, the automated defense grid of a shipbuilding colony this size opened fire within the first 90 seconds of atmospheric breach, if only to die with a full magazine. He watched the tactical display through the reinforced glass of his command shuttle, waiting for the flare of ground batteries, the familiar red bloom of a colony fighting for its life. Nothing came. "Confirm defense grid status," he said. His adjutant, a narrow-shouldered officer named Rook, tapped through 3 separate channels before answering. "Offline, Overseer, all of it. Powered down at the source, not disabled remotely. Looks like someone walked out to the substations and threw the switches themselves." "That's absurd." "There's also this." Rook forwarded a broadcast, already looping on an open frequency. No encryption, nothing hidden about it at all. A human voice, flat and unhurried, reciting coordinates for a surrender staging ground and a request, not a plea. A request that ground forces avoid damaging the shipyard's crane rigging, since it would, in the voice's words, save everyone a great deal of paperwork later. Callas Dren read that line 4 times. He had conquered 6 worlds in his career. He had watched populations weep, riot, burn their own cities rather than kneel. He had never once been asked to be careful with the cranes. "Careful with the cranes," Rook repeated, testing the words like they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. "Log it," Callas said, and was faintly, uncomfortably aware that some deep and reliable instinct in him, the one that had kept him alive across 6 campaigns, did not feel triumphant. It felt like walking into a room where the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. Down on the surface, in the staging yard outside the Thessaly shipyard's outer gate, Elias Vantry stood in a line of 11,000 people and watched a directorate quartermaster hand out neural collars like a man distributing raffle tickets. He was 58 years old. His knees had opinions about standing on ferrocrete for 4 hours that they were not shy about sharing. Beside him, his daughter Petra shifted her weight from foot to foot, arms crossed tight over her chest, jaw set in the particular way it's set when she was frightened and didn't want anyone to see it, which in Elia's experience was the only kind of frightened that mattered. "Dad," she said, not looking at him, "everybody just gave up. I don't understand why everybody just gave up." "We didn't give up," Elias said. "They're putting collars on us." "I know. That doesn't sound like not giving up." Elias watched the line move forward 1 body length at a time. Up ahead, a directorate trooper in matte black armor was fitting the collars with the bored efficiency of a man doing the 200th oil change of his shift, barely glancing at the necks he clamped them around. Elias filed that away. Boredom was information. Boredom meant nobody up the chain expected this to require attention. "You remember your grandfather's stories," he said, "about the last war. The one you don't talk about." "I don't talk about it because talking about wars is how you convince yourself you understood one." He said it without heat, the way he said most things, like a man reading a gauge rather than making an argument. "Your grandfather used to say something. He said the empires that win quick wars are the ones who never had to build anything themselves. They inherit machines. They inherit workers. They never had to sit up at 2 in the morning figuring out why a weld's failing, so they never learn what a weld failing actually costs someone. They don't respect the work. They respect the result. And that matters because a man who respects the result, and not the work, will always, eventually, trust the wrong signature." Petra looked at him like he'd started speaking in a different language, which, fair enough, he had. The line moved. The trooper reached them. Elias tilted his chin up without being asked, exposing his throat. the posture of a man who had done this kind of thing, some version of this kind of thing before. The collar clicked shut, cold, heavier than it looked, a thin vibration settling somewhere behind his ear like a held note. He felt his pulse spike once, hard, an animal reflex, and made himself breathe it down before the collar's sensors could decide it meant something. Beside him, Petra's collar clicked shut a half-second later. She made a small sound, more surprise than pain, and Elias reached over without looking and put 2 fingers briefly against the back of her wrist. Steady. It was the same gesture his own father had used on him once, a lifetime and a war ago, and it apparently still worked because her breathing evened out. 3 positions down the line, a directorate logistics officer with a data slate was calling names off a manifest, cross-referencing them against something. He stopped on one. Akoy Renata Akoy. Elia's peripheral vision found her before his head turned, a compact, sharp-eyed woman in a metallurgist's coveralls, colony patch still stitched to the shoulder, standing 4 rows over. She didn't answer right away. Elias had known her 20 years. He knew that pause. It was not fear. It was a woman doing arithmetic. "That's me," Renata said. The logistics officer studied his slate, then studied her, with the mild irritation of a man whose day had just acquired an unscheduled complication. "Your registry lists you as Senior Metallurgical Certifier, Colony Infrastructure Division, Materials Science, Structural Tolerance Analysis, Welding Certification Authority." "That's the job, yes." He tapped something into the slate, spoke briefly into a calm beat at his collar, listened to a response Elias couldn't hear, and then said, in the tone of a man relaying an order he found mildly beneath him, "You're being reassigned. Quality Assurance Division, Thessaly Shipyard Structural Certification Post, effective immediately." He looked up. "Congratulations, you're an inspector now." He said it the way you'd tell someone they'd been promoted to filing cabinet. Renata's collar clicked shut. She glanced once briefly across the yard, not searching, not panicked, just a single efficient sweep, and found Elia's eyes for perhaps a second and a half. Neither of them changed expression. Elia's face did nothing at all, the practiced nothing of a man who had learned exactly how much a face could say before it said too much. But something passed between them anyway, the way it does between 2 people who have spent 2 decades solving the same class of problem from different disciplines, and have developed, without ever discussing it, a shorthand for interesting. Then the line moved, and she was escorted toward a different transport, and the moment closed over like water. Up in orbit, Callas Dren was reviewing the reassignment logs with the mild satisfaction of a man discovering his new appliance had more settings than expected. "Metallurgist," Rook said, reading over his shoulder. "Structural certification. That's useful. Our own QA staff have been backed up 11 cycles on the refit queue, if she's competent." "She'll be competent," Callas said. "They all seem to be. That's rather the point of them, isn't it? Efficient labor at minimal cost. The Ascendancy didn't authorize this campaign because human beings are interesting, Rook. They authorized it because human beings are cheap and thorough." He said this the way he might describe a favorable interest rate. "Put her on the capital ship queue. If she certifies half as fast as their foreman's crews are already moving cargo, we'll have the fleet's refit backlog cleared by the time Overseer Dominic's inspection convoy arrives. You want a human signing off on Directorate warship hulls. I want the paperwork finished, Rook. I don't much care whose hand holds the stamp." He said it lightly. He said it the way men say things right before those things become the exact sentence they most regret, though of course he had no way of knowing that yet, and wouldn't for 3 more days, by which point the sentence would already be historical rather than merely careless. Down in the yard, the last of the collars clicked shut, and 11,000 people who had, 6 hours earlier, been free citizens of an independent colony were sorted into work details with the brisk efficiency of cargo being manifested. Elias Vantry was assigned to Thessaly Shipyard Structural Repair Division, Hull Section 4. Petra was assigned beside him, a small mercy. Or perhaps simply administrative convenience. It didn't matter which, only that it happened. As they were marched toward the shuttle bay, Petra leaned close enough that only Elias could hear her. "Dad, what did you and Renata just do? That thing with your eyes?" Elias watched the shipyard rise ahead of them through the shuttle's viewport, vast, dark, magnificent in the way that things built by people who'd never had to fix their own mistakes are magnificent, all scale and no humility. "We agreed on a diagnosis," he said. "Of what?" "Of them." He nodded very slightly toward the armored trooper standing at the shuttle's rear hatch, close enough to hear every word, understanding none of what it meant. "They've never had to build anything themselves, Petra. They've only ever received things. And a man who's never built anything doesn't know how to look at something and ask whether it was built right." He settled back into the hard bench seat, closing his eyes, looking for all the world like a tired old man accepting his fate. "He only knows how to check whether it was signed." The shuttle doors sealed. Somewhere above them, 72 hours began quietly ticking down, though only one side of this conversation yet understood that a clock was running at all. The interior of Thessaly shipyard smelled like ozone and cold metal, and the first thing Elias Vantry did upon arriving was ask for a clipboard. Not a weapon, not a way out, a clipboard. The Directorate Shift Supervisor, assigned to Hull Section 4, a broad-shouldered trooper named Vesic, who clearly considered himself several rungs above babysitting slave labor, stared at Elias for a long moment, as if waiting for the request to reveal itself as some kind of joke. "You want a asterisk clipboard asterisk. Or a slate, whatever you use for shift logs." Elias kept his voice level, unhurried, the voice of a man asking for a socket wrench, not a man 3 hours removed from having a collar clamped around his throat. "You've got 1,100 people walking into a repair yard they've never worked in, on equipment they've never touched, under a quota system nobody's explained to them. Somebody needs to track who's doing what, or you're going to lose the whole first shift to people standing around asking each other questions." Vesic's expression didn't change, but something behind it recalculated. "You have experience with labor management. 40 years running shipfitting crews before your directorate ever heard of Halden's Reach." Elias let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. "I'm not asking for authority. I'm asking for a way to keep track of who's where, so your quotas get hit instead of missed. That's all a clipboard is." Vesic glanced at the overhead camera dome, a reflex, checking to see if someone above him was watching, which someone was, and then handed over a data slate with the particular relief of a man who had just been given permission to stop thinking about a problem. By the second hour of the shift, Elias had built a shift roster. By the fourth, he'd built a requisition tracking sheet, a tool checkout log, and a running tally of quota output broken down by team, because he had learned a long time ago, in a war he still didn't talk about, that the fastest way to make a bureaucracy stop looking at you was to hand it more paperwork than it knew what to do with, all of it accurate, all of it boring, all of it exactly what it asked for. Petra, assigned to a welding team 2 bays over, found him during the 10-minute changeover and looked at the data slate in his hands like it had personally betrayed her. "You're doing asterisk filing." "I'm doing filing." "Dad, they collared 11,000 people this morning, and you're filling out a asterisk tool checkout log." "Keep your voice down." He said it without looking up from the slate, without any change in tone, which was somehow more effective than sharpness would have been. "You know what happens to a slave workforce that organizes itself around defiance, Petra. Somebody gets made an example of within the first week. Public, ugly, memorable. It's the oldest trick in the book. You break the compliant ones by making them watch what happens to the brave ones." He finally glanced up. "You know what happens to a slave workforce that organizes itself around asterisk paperwork." "What?" "Nobody watches it. Nobody's ever been afraid of a filing system." Petra didn't have an answer for that. She went back to her bay looking unconvinced, and Elias went back to his slate. And up in the orbital command deck of the Directorate flagship, Overseer Callas Dren watched the morning's productivity telemetry scroll past his console with the specific pleasure of a man whose gamble was paying off faster than he dared hope. Hull Section 4 is running at 91% quota efficiency, Rook reported. After 4 hours, Sections 1 through 3 are averaging 60. The difference is entirely attributable to a single labor coordinator the humans appear to have appointed themselves. Vantry, Callas said, he'd already pulled the name, the one who wanted a clipboard. You find that amusing. I find it illuminating. Callas leaned back, steepling his fingers, wearing the expression of a man describing an investment strategy at a dinner party. This is precisely the temperament the pre-invasion assessments described, Rook. Highly systemizing, deeply uncomfortable with disorder. Give a human species chaos, and they will spend their first waking hour building a filing system to make the chaos legible, purely because an illegible universe offends something in their psychology. He tapped the data pad. It's their greatest weakness. It makes them extraordinarily easy to manage. You simply give them a system to obey, and they will police that system more rigorously than we ever could. Rook, who had served under Callas for 11 years and had developed the specific talent of knowing when a comment was best left unsaid, said nothing. Later that cycle, Overseer Dominic, Callas's superior, a lean aristocratic figure who conducted even routine correspondence with the theatrical gravity of a man auditioning for a portrait, opened a holographic channel to inquire, with faint condescension, whether the labor situation was proving manageable. Manageable, Overseer, is an understatement, Callas said, and Elias would have appreciated, had he been able to hear it, exactly how accurate that sentence was about to become in ways Callas did not intend. The human workforce is, in a word, self-managing. They've organized their own shift rotations, built their own tracking systems. One of their foremen has produced documentation more thorough than anything my own logistics division has generated in a full cycle. He allowed himself the small pleasure of a compliment paid to an underling in the guise of a compliment paid to himself. Frankly, Overseer, I've never seen a workforce this eager to be useful asterisk. Dominic's holographic eyebrow rose a fraction. Eager. Compliant, driven, obsessively organized. It's rather like managing an entire division of accountants who also happen to weld. Callas allowed himself a small, satisfied smile at his own wit. I'd venture the ascendancy underestimated exactly how easy this species would be to run, once you understand what motivates them. And what does motivate them, Commander? Order, Overseer. Give a human being enough order to organize, and they will hand you their loyalty as a side effect, without you ever having to ask for it. Dominic considered this with the mild interest of a man filing away a useful data point, said something about expecting the fleet fully refueled and refit within the standard window, and closed the channel, leaving Callas with the particular glow of a subordinate who believes he has just impressed a superior, which is a glow that, historically speaking, precedes disaster with remarkable consistency. 3 decks below the command bridge, in a windowless annex that had been hastily converted into a quality assurance office, Renata Akoi was being shown to her new post by a Directorate Certifications administrator named Ulla, a fussy, precise creature who clearly regarded the reassignment of a slave laborer into an inspection role as a minor professional indignity she intended to survive with dignity. You'll review structural repair logs, Ulla explained, gesturing at a terminal stacked with queued hull assessments. Weld integrity, containment field calibration, thermal stress tolerances. You certify with your registered signature, biometric, non-transferable, and the certification propagates automatically into the fleet's flight authorization systems. No ship jumps to FTL without a valid structural certificate on file. It's a formality mostly. Our own engineers rarely find anything requiring more than a stamp. A formality, The real work was done building the ships properly in the first place, generations ago. Allah said this with the faint superiority of someone quoting institutional wisdom she'd never personally tested. Certification exists mainly to satisfy ascendancy regulatory requirements. You'll find it undemanding. Renata looked at the queue. 41 ships awaiting hull certification, backlog notation flagged red, priority escalating. She had spent 20 years of her life certifying colony infrastructure, habitat domes, cargo elevators, orbital docking clamps, under regulations that existed precisely because someone once had trusted a formality and buried people for it. She understood, in the particular way a metallurgist understands the difference between a material that is strong and a material that merely looks strong under normal load, exactly what kind of authority had just been placed, casually, unthinkingly, into her hands. "I have a question," she said. Allah, already halfway to the door, paused. "Yes. If I flag additional inspection requirements, request expanded authority to review not just the completed repairs but the certification process itself, streamline the queue, that sort of thing, who approves that?" Allah considered the request the way a bureaucrat considers any request that promises to reduce her own workload. Overseer-level sign-off, typically. Given the backlog, I imagine Commander Dren would approve almost anything that clears these logs faster. She said it without suspicion, without weight, the way you'd mention that a door happened to be unlocked. "Draft the request. I'll forward it." When she'd gone, Renata sat alone in the small annex for a moment, looking at the queue of 41 warships, each one waiting on a signature that did not yet exist, and thought about a conversation she'd had years ago with Elias Vantry over a failed containment weld on a colony fuel depot. A conversation about tolerances, about the gap between what a specification demanded and what a material could actually survive, and about how very few people in her experience ever thought to ask which of those two things actually mattered. She began drafting the request. That evening, ship time, an order came down from Overseer Dominic's staff, relayed through Callas Dren to every section supervisor in Thessaly shipyard, and it read, in its entirety, that in light of the exceptional productivity demonstrated across all labor divisions on day one, output quotas would be increased by 20% effective the following cycle, to properly utilize the workforce's demonstrated capacity. Elias Vantry read the order on his data slate in the flickering light of Hull Section 4's evening shutdown, standing beside Petra, who read it over his shoulder and made a small, disbelieving sound in the back of her throat. "They're punishing us for working hard." "No," Elias said, and for the first time that day, something in his voice was almost warm, not with humor exactly, but with the particular satisfaction of a man watching a very old, very reliable pattern confirm itself precisely on schedule. "They're teaching us exactly how much rope they're willing to hand us and calling it a reward." He tucked the slate under his arm and looked out through the hull section's viewport, toward the dry-docked shape of a directorate cruiser suspended in its gantry, half-stripped, waiting for repair. "Which is useful information, Petra, very useful information indeed." 2 bays away, unseen, Renata Akoy's expanded certification request was quietly approved without a second glance, and the countdown, though no clock on the shipyard registered it, ticked forward by another 12 hours. The quota increase hit Hull Section 4 at 600 the following cycle, and by 6:15 Elias Vantry had already redrawn the entire shift schedule to absorb it, because a man who spends his life managing crews learns that the fastest way to survive an unreasonable demand is to look, immediately and visibly, like you were expecting it. 20%, Petra said, reading the new numbers off the shared terminal, on top of yesterday's 91. "Then we'll hit 111, Elias said, already sketching crew rotations onto the slate. "And tomorrow they'll ask for more, and we'll hit that too, and the day after that they'll stop asking, because at some point a number stops looking like effort and starts looking like asterisk capacity asterisk. And once a man believes he's found your ceiling, he stops watching how you get there. Petra didn't answer right away. She was watching her father's hands move across the slate, steady, unhurried, the hands of someone solving a scheduling problem. Nothing more. And it occurred to her, not for the first time since the collar had gone around her neck, that she had spent 26 years thinking she understood exactly who her father was, and had apparently been wrong about at least one important dimension of him the entire time. Section 4, Bay 6, Elia said, tapping her assignment into the roster. You're on hull patch repair today. Cruiser designation. He checked the manifest, ardent discipline. Take Osai and Marchetti with you. That's not my usual specialty. It's your specialty today. He didn't look up. I want you on it specifically. She caught something in the way he said asterisk, specifically asterisk. Not an instruction exactly, more like a door left slightly open. But the shift horn sounded before she could ask what it meant, and 1,100 people moved toward their bays with the brisk, unbothered efficiency of a workforce that had, by all outward appearances, already accepted its cage. Bay 6 was hot, loud, and smelled like scorched alloy. The ardent discipline hung in her gantry cradle overhead, 140 meters of battle-worn Directorate cruiser, her outer hull scarred with the kind of microfractures that accumulate over decades of hard maneuvering and harder repairs. Patched, repatched, patched again by whoever'd been cheapest to hire at the time. Petra's crew was assigned Section 14 Charlie, a stretch of hull along the aft thermal shielding that had failed a routine stress scan 3 cycles prior. Elias arrived 20 minutes into the shift, ostensibly to inspect progress. In reality, Petra understood this only in retrospect, to stand close enough to talk without being overheard by the supervising trooper stationed at the bay's entrance, 40 meters away, bored, half watching a wrist display instead of the work floor. Talk me through your weld plan, Elias said, loud enough to sound like supervision. Petra pulled up the repair spec on her slate. Standard patch procedure. Cut back to sound metal, prep the joint, lay the weld in 3 passes, harmonic test the seam before sign-off. Show me your harmonic testing parameters. She showed him. He studied the numbers for a long moment, then reached over and without asking, adjusted one field, the resonance dampening tolerance. By a value so small Petra had to look twice to confirm it had changed at all. Dad, that's outside spec. It's inside asterisk their asterisk spec, Elias said. Their tolerance band is wider than it should be for a hull this age with this many prior patches. Nobody checks the cumulative effect of a 4th or 5th weld on a section that's already been stressed 3 times before. They only check whether asterisk this weld in isolation passes asterisk this asterisk test. He tapped the number back to what looked, to Petra's eye, like an entirely unremarkable value. So we're going to make sure this weld passes the test, every single time, cleanly. No flags, no red marks, no reason for anyone to look twice. Then what did you just do? I adjusted where within the passing range the weld sits. He said it the way another man might describe adjusting a thermostat by half a degree. Every weld has a resonance signature, a frequency it wants to vibrate at under stress. Inside the tolerance band, that signature can sit anywhere and still pass. Most welders don't think about where in that band they land because it doesn't matter for a single ship doing a single jump under normal conditions. He met her eyes. It only starts to matter if a great many welds, on a great many ships, are all sitting at the same specific point in that band, and all those ships happen to jump to FTL at the exact same moment. Petra felt something cold move down through her chest that had nothing to do with the bay's environmental controls. You're not sabotaging anything, she said slowly. No. You're making sure it asterisk passes. That's the whole trick, Petra. Sabotage gets caught. Sabotage leaves marks. What we're doing will pass every inspection anyone runs because there is nothing to find. We're not breaking their tolerances. We're using them exactly as specified. He picked up the welding torch and held it out to her. An ordinary tool in an ordinary hand. You asked me yesterday why I was filling out a tool check log instead of planning something. This is the something. It just doesn't look like anything because that's the point. She took the torch. Her hands were steadier than she expected, which surprised her more than the plan itself had. Trust the spec, Elias said, and walked on to the next bay as if he'd never stopped moving at all, and the trooper by the entrance never looked up from his wrist display. And 40 meters away, a weld went into a hull patch that would pass, correctly, cleanly, and without incident, every test anyone would ever think to run on it right up until it mattered. 3 decks up, in the certifications annex, Renata Akoy's expanded authority had been quietly approved overnight, and by mid-cycle she found herself with sign-off responsibility not merely for individual repair jobs, but for the entire fleet's structural clearance queue, 41 ships, soon to be the entire assembled battle fleet once refit and refuel completed, every one of them requiring her cryptographic certification before FTL authorization would engage. It was, by any reasonable measure, an absurd amount of power to hand a conquered laborer, and it had happened not because anyone had been careless, but because everyone along the chain had been, in their own narrow way, entirely reasonable. Ulla had wanted her backlog cleared. Callas Dren had wanted his productivity numbers to keep climbing so he could keep reporting them to Dominic. Dominic had wanted the fleet refit finished on schedule so he could report that upward in turn. Nobody at any point had asked the one question that would have mattered. Should a single enslaved metallurgist hold sole certifying authority over an entire war fleet? Because the question that had actually been asked at every level was simply asterisk, is the work getting done faster? And the answer, every time, had been yes. The one moment it nearly came apart happened in the early afternoon, when a Directorate senior auditor named Kessa Vorn, visiting from Fleet Logistics Command to review certification throughput ahead of Dominic's inspection, pulled Renata's recent sign-offs at random and found, to her evident irritation, 41 clean certifications processed in a fraction of the time her own division typically required. This pace is unusual, Vorn said, standing over Renata's terminal with the particular suspicion of an official who has built a career on distrusting anything that looks too easy. Explain your methodology. Renata did not flinch, because flinching required believing she had something to flinch about, and she had built her entire professional identity, for 20 years, on the specific competence of catching flaws other people missed, which made it, she reflected later, almost funny that the flaw she was now hiding was one she herself had designed. Standard tolerance band verification per Directorate Structural Code, cross-referenced against material stress history, she said, and pulled up a clean, thorough, entirely accurate report showing exactly that, because it was exactly that. I've cross-checked each hull's prior repair record against current tolerance requirements and flagged nothing outside acceptable parameters. If Auditor Vorn would like to spot-check my methodology against any specific vessel, I'd welcome it. Vorn selected a ship at random, the Ardent Discipline asterisk. As it happened, though neither woman in that room understood the significance of that particular coincidence, and reviewed Renata's certification line by line, weld by weld, tolerance figure by tolerance figure, for 11 long minutes while Renata sat with the stillness of a woman who had, in a previous life, spent countless hours defending colony infrastructure certifications to regulators who wanted her fired for finding problems nobody wanted found. Vorn found nothing wrong. There was nothing wrong to find. Thorough, Vorn admitted, with the grudging tone of a critic denied her expected kill. More thorough, frankly, than most of my own staff's work. She glanced toward the annex door, where Callas Dren had just arrived, alerted by an aide that a senior auditor was reviewing his shipyard certification process unannounced, never a comfortable development for a commander hopping to impress his superior. "Is there a concern, Auditor Vorn?" Callas asked, stepping in with the smooth, faintly proprietary tone of a man defending an investment he'd already publicly praised to Overseer Dominic. "None," Vorn said, somewhat sourly. "The human inspector's work is exemplary. I was simply verifying the pace wasn't compromising accuracy." "I could have told you it wasn't," Callas said, and here was the moment. Though nobody in the room recognized it as one, he placed his own reputation, deliberately and publicly, behind Renata Okoy's signature. "This workforce has demonstrated nothing but precision since the moment we arrived. I'll vouch for the inspector's methodology personally, Auditor. Put my name against hers if it satisfies the record." Vorn, satisfied, made a note, thanked them both with the brisk indifference of a woman who had a dozen more shipyards to audit that cycle, and left. Renata did not look at Callas after he'd gone. She looked instead at her own hands on the terminal, at the queue of 39 remaining ships still awaiting her signature, and thought about the word vouch and what it would come to mean in roughly 40 hours, once the fleet received its jump order and Overseer Callas Dren's personal, publicly recorded endorsement of her work became, retroactively, the single most damning sentence of his career. She finished the day's certifications without another interruption. Down in Hull Section 4, Elias Vantry logged out his crew's shift totals, filed them neatly into the tracking system he himself had built, and noted, with the small private satisfaction of a man watching a long game unfold exactly on schedule, that Bay 6 had completed Section 14 Charlie on the Ardent Discipline 2 hours ahead of projection. Weld integrity nominal, harmonic test passed clean, no flags raised. 40 hours remained until fleet refuel completed and the jump order went out, and by every measure the Directorate's own systems could produce. Everything, every log, every stamp, every signature said that everything was exactly, perfectly, reassuringly fine. The final 12 hours began with a maintenance drone falling out of the sky. It wasn't sabotage, not directly, not yet, just an aging Directorate cargo drone whose grav stabilizer finally gave out after decades of budget-conscious neglect, dropping 40 meters onto the deck plating outside Bay 9, with a crash loud enough to bring half of Hull Section 4's night shift to a dead stop. For 3 long seconds, Elias Vantry's heart did something it hadn't done since the surrender, a hard, cold lurch. The specific fear of a man who has spent 3 days building something invisible and is suddenly certain, however briefly, that it's been found out. Then the drone's diagnostic panel lit up, blinked twice, and displayed, in the Directorate's own clean administrative script, a fault code that translated roughly to component fatigue, scheduled replacement overdue by 340 cycles. Elias exhaled. "Just tell me," Petra said, arriving at a jog, wiping grease from her hands with a rag that had long since stopped being useful for that purpose. "That wasn't us." "That wasn't us." Elias looked at the drone a moment longer, at the small crowd of Directorate maintenance staff already gathering to argue about whose budget line the replacement part came out of, and felt, despite himself, a flicker of something almost like amusement. "Although I'll admit there's a certain poetry to it." Poetry. Their whole empires held together with parts that were overdue for replacement 300 cycles ago, Petra, and nobody noticed, until one fell out of the sky in front of 100 witnesses. He started walking back toward Bay 6, and she fell into step beside him, because falling into step beside him was easier than saying the thing she'd actually come to say, until it wasn't anymore. "I want to know the whole plan," she said. "Not pieces of it, all of it now." Elias didn't stop walking, but something in his shoulders settled, the particular posture of a man who has been waiting for this exact conversation, and is relieved more than anything that it's finally arrived. 12 hours, he said. The fleet finishes refueling at 400 ship time. Jump order goes out at 600. reinforcing the front at Corville Reach. That's not a guess. That's from the requisition manifests I've been tracking since day one, because fuel orders tell you everything about troop movements if you know how to read them. He glanced sideways at her. Every ship in that fleet has been through Thessaly's repair queue in the last 3 days. Every one of them has hull work done by our crews. Every one of them has a structural certificate signed by Renata Akoy. Because you made sure of that. Because she made sure of that. I only fixed welds. She made herself the only signature that mattered. He said it with something that might, in another man, have been pride, but in Elia's came out simply as fact, stated plainly, the way he'd state a torque spec. You asked me yesterday what I did to your harmonic tolerance numbers. I want you to understand exactly what that number does, because you're the one who's going to have to live with having done it. They reached the edge of Bay 6, empty at this hour except for the low hum of idle equipment, and Elias pulled up a schematic on his slate. The kind of technical diagram Petra had grown up around her entire life, familiar as breathing, except now it made her stomach turn in a way schematics never had before. A weld carries a resonance signature, he said. Every joint, every patch, every hull section, it all wants to vibrate at some frequency under stress, and normally that frequency is random, scattered across the tolerance band because nobody's controlling for it. What we've done across every ship in that fleet is make sure every weld sits at the same asterisk point in that band. Not outside spec, not flagged, just aligned. All of it pointing the same direction, waiting for the same trigger. FTL jump. An FTL jump puts every hull in a fleet under identical, simultaneous stress, all at once, all in the same direction relative to the jump vector. If the welds are scattered randomly, that stress disperses safely, the way it's supposed to. If the welds are aligned, he didn't finish the sentence because he didn't need to. Petra had grown up on shipyards, she could finish it herself, and the finishing of it was worse coming from her own head than it would have been from his mouth. They'll resonate together, she said quietly, all at once. All at once. Elias closed the schematic. It won't look like an attack, Petra. There's no code to trace, no weapon to find, no enemy fleet to blame. Every log will say every ship passed every inspection perfectly. It'll look like exactly what it is, a fleet that was old, over-repaired, and finally failed under load, the way tired metal always eventually does. The only difference is we chose asterisk when. Petra was quiet for a long moment, turning it over, and when she spoke again, her voice had a hardness in it Elias hadn't heard from his daughter before, not anger, something colder and more finished than anger. That's not sabotage, she said. That's a verdict. Yes. On thousands of people. On an empire that put collars on 11,000 of hours in one afternoon and called it a Tuesday, Elias said, and for the first time in 3 days, something in his flat, careful voice cracked open just slightly, just enough to show what was underneath it. I'm not going to pretend to you that this is clean, Petra. It isn't. People who never fitted a single collar onto a single neck are going to die on those ships tomorrow, alongside the ones who did. I've thought about that every hour since I adjusted my first tolerance number, and I don't have a version of this where that isn't true. He looked at her directly, and there was nothing performed in it, nothing rehearsed. But I watched what your grandfather's generation did when they tried to fight an empire like this one honestly, ship to ship, gun to gun. I watched what it cost. And I decided a long time ago that if it ever came to this again, I wasn't going to let anyone die proving a point that could be made cheaper. Petra looked at her father for a long moment, this quiet, unremarkable man who filled out tool logs and adjusted his glasses and had, over the last 3 days, quietly designed the death of a fleet using nothing but a welding torch and the Empire's own paperwork, and found, to her surprise, that the thing she felt wasn't horror. It was recognition. Okay, she said finally. Okay. You already told me trust the spec. She managed something that wasn't quite a smile. I trusted the spec. 3 decks above them, in the certifications annex, Renata Akoi was completing the last of the fleet's structural sign-offs with 4 hours to spare before the jump order, and finding, much to her own private and grimly amused surprise, that her greatest obstacle in the final stretch was not suspicion, but praise. Ulla had stopped by twice to compliment her processing speed. A junior directorate engineer had asked, with what appeared to be genuine professional admiration, whether human certification methodology might be worth adopting empire-wide going forward. And Overseer Callas Dren himself appeared in the annex doorway just past midnight, ship time, apparently unable to resist checking in personally on what had become, in his own account of things to Overseer Dominic, the single greatest productivity success story of his career. 41 ships, Callas said, reviewing the completed queue over her shoulder with the satisfied posture of a man admiring a portfolio. Certified, cleared, ready for the morning's jump order. Do you have any idea, Inspector Akoi, how rare it is for a fleet-wide refit to complete entirely without incident? I have some idea, Renata said, and meant it more precisely than he could possibly understand. I intend to commend your work personally in my report to Overseer Dominic, Callas continued, entirely oblivious to the specific weight of what he was about to say next, the sentence that would, in roughly 6 hours, become the single most quoted line in whatever inquiry followed this. I've already told the fleet auditor I'll vouch for your methodology myself. I want it understood, Inspector, that this shipyard's success this cycle rests substantially on your signature. That's very generous of you, Overseer. Not generosity, accuracy. He said it with the particular smugness of a man who believes he has correctly identified and exploited a resource nobody else valued properly. And in a certain narrow sense, he simply hadn't asked the one question that would have mattered, the same question nobody along the entire chain had thought to ask across 3 full days. What does it mean that we've made a single enslaved woman the sole gatekeeper of our entire fleet's survival? And what happens if she decides we shouldn't survive it? He left the annex a few minutes later, pleased with himself, unaware that he had just spent his own credibility as currency in a transaction he didn't know he was part of. Renata sat alone at her terminal after he'd gone, looking at 41 green certification marks glowing softly on her screen, each one technically flawless, each one entirely honest by the letter of every regulation the Directorate had ever written, and each one a signature on a fleet that would, in a matter of hours, cease to exist in any form that mattered. She thought briefly of the colony fuel depot weld she'd argued about with Elias years ago, the one that had eventually failed, killing 4 people, because someone upstream had trusted a tolerance number instead of asking what the number actually meant. She had spent 20 years afterward making sure that never happened again on her watch. It occurred to her, with a kind of grim, exhausted clarity, that she was about to make sure of the exact opposite, on a scale that dwarfed anything she'd imagined that day in the depot, and that she was not, in fact, going to lose a single hour of sleep over it. She logged the final certification, closed the terminal, and went to find Elias because there were 6 hours left, and there was still one thing left to prepare that no inspection queue would ever record. The jump order went out at 600 ship time, exactly on schedule, and Overseer Callas Dren watched it transmit across the fleet's tactical display with the quiet, settled satisfaction of a man who had, by every measure available to him, just closed out the finest 3 days of his career. Fleet status, he said, more out of habit than necessity, because the numbers had said the same thing for 6 straight hours. All vessels fueled, refit, and certified, Rook confirmed. 41 capital ships full complement, structural clearance signed and logged for every hull, jump vector calculated for Corville Reach. We're ready on your mark, Overseer. Then let's not keep Overseer Dominic waiting. Callas allowed himself, for just a moment, the pleasure of imagining the report he'd send once the fleet arrived, early, intact, and freshly repaired by a labor force so productive it had become, In the space of 3 days, the single most efficient shipyard operation in the sector. Signal the fleet. Jump on my command. Down on the surface of Halden's Reach, in a converted supervisor's office that had, until 3 days ago, belonged to a directorate shift manager, and now belonged, in every practical sense that mattered, to Elias Vantry, Renata Akoi stood at a small console with Petra beside her, watching a live feed of the fleet's jump countdown scroll across the bottom of the screen. 30 seconds, Renata said. You don't have to watch, Elias told her quietly, not looking away from the screen himself, which was its own kind of honesty. Neither do you. He didn't argue the point. Above them, in the Directorate flagship's command center, the countdown reached its final mark, and 41 warships engaged their faster-than-light drives within the same 3-second window, exactly as a fleet is supposed to. Exactly as it had been done 10,000 times before across the long history of an empire that had never once had reason to look closely at the metal holding its ships together. For 2 full seconds, nothing happened that shouldn't have. Then the *Ardent Discipline, the first ship to complete its jump sequence, the first hull Petra Vantry had personally welded 3 days earlier, dropped out of FTL 11 seconds early, her aft thermal shielding fracturing along a seam that every log, every certificate, every inspection had confirmed as flawless, because it was flawless. Right up until the exact resonance frequency it had been engineered to carry, met the exact stress a coordinated fleet-wide jump was designed to produce. Report, Callas said, and for the first time in 3 days there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Ardent Discipline has dropped from formation, Rook said, staring at a status board that had, in the span of 4 seconds, gone from uniform green to a single flickering amber warning. Structural failure, aft section. She's overseer, she's not the only one. Across the tactical display, one by one, in a pattern too regular to be coincidence and too widespread to be anything but design, warning markers began flashing amber, then red across the fleet. Not simultaneously, not in a single catastrophic instant that might have looked like an attack, but in a slow, staggered, almost gentle cascade, each ship failing a few seconds or minutes after the last, in a sequence that told its own story to anyone who understood what they were looking at, which, in that first terrible hour, was nobody aboard the Directorate flagship at all. Enemy contact, Callas demanded. Are we under fire? No contact, Overseer. No hostile signature, no weapons fire, nothing on any sensor. Rook's hands moved across his console with increasing desperation. It's structural. Every failure is structural. Hull stress, containment breach, thermal cascade, it's like the ships are simply coming apart. That's not possible. Those hulls were certified. They were certified, sir. That's the... Rook stopped himself, some new and terrible thought arriving a half-second too late to be useful. Sir, every one of these ships passed inspection through Thessaly shipyard. Everyone was certified by the same inspector. Callas Dren stood very still. Somewhere in the part of his mind that had spent 3 days congratulating itself on human efficiency, on human eagerness to please, on the marvelous ease with which an entire enslaved population had organized itself into obedient, productive order, a single sentence surfaced, unbidden in his own voice, spoken less than 6 hours earlier in a certification's Annex 3 decks below. I want it understood, Inspector, that this shipyard success this cycle rests substantially on your signature. He had said that. He had meant it as praise. Get me a channel to the surface, Callas said very quietly. Now. The channel opened 40 seconds later, patched through to the same converted office where Elias Vantry, Petra, and Renata Akoi stood watching the same tactical feed the Directorate fleet itself was watching. And Callas Dren found himself looking at 3 faces that showed him nothing at all, no triumph, no fear, nothing performed for his benefit. What have you done? Callas said. It wasn't quite a question. Nothing outside specification, Overseer, Renata said. Every certification I signed was accurate. Every weld met your tolerance requirements exactly as written. You're welcome to review any of it. I imagine you already are. Your fleet is dying, Callas said, and something in his aristocratic composure had finally, fully cracked. Ships are failing across the entire formation. You will explain to me precisely what was done to them, or I will. Or you'll what, Overseer? Elias said, stepping into frame, and there was no anger in his voice, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. Bombard a colony whose workforce you personally told your superior officer was the most productive labor force you'd ever managed. Execute an inspector you vouch for by name, on the record, not 6 hours ago. Go ahead. Explain that decision to Overseer Dominic. I imagine he'll have questions of his own. You sabotaged my fleet. We built exactly what you asked us to build, to exactly the tolerances you specified, and we certified it exactly as your own regulations required, Elias said. If you want to know what actually happened, ask your engineers to explain to you what a resonance-aligned weld does under simultaneous fleet-wide FTL stress. It's in your own textbooks, Overseer. Nobody at Thessaly ever thought to check for it because nobody ever built anything themselves long enough to know it was worth checking. We've been checking things like that our whole lives. He paused. You didn't lose your fleet to a weapon. You lost it to a question you never thought to ask. On the tactical display behind Callas Dren, the last amber warning turned to red, then to a flat, silent gray. Not with the violence of an explosion, not with the drama of a firefight, but with the quiet, mechanical finality of a system that had simply, comprehensively, stopped working, exactly the way tired metal always eventually does when nobody asks the right questions about it in time. Callas Dren stood on his bridge, surrounded by the wreckage of a war fleet that no enemy had fired a single shot to destroy, and found that he had no order left to give that would change anything, because there was no enemy to strike back at, no code to purge, no saboteur to execute, only paperwork, correct in every particular, bearing his own personal endorsement that had quietly, patiently, over the course of exactly 3 days, become the most effective weapon ever used against his empire. The channel closed. Nobody on the surface reopened it. In the converted office, Petra let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for several hours, and looked at her father whose hands, she noticed for the first time since the collars had gone on, were shaking very slightly, not from fear, and not from guilt exactly, but from something adjacent to both, the particular tremor of a man who has just done something he believed necessary and is only now, in the silence afterward, allowing himself to feel the full weight of having done it. "Dad," she said quietly. "I'm all right," he said, and put his hands in his pockets, and after a moment mostly he was. Renata was already turning back to her terminal, pulling up a new queue, not certifications this time, but salvage manifests, supply inventories, the beginning of whatever came next for a colony that had just, in the space of 72 hours, gone from conquered to holding the only shipyard in the sector whose inspectors actually understood what these hulls could survive. "There's a lot of rebuilding ahead," she said, "and I imagine the Ascendancy's next fleet is going to arrive with considerably more questions than the last one did." "Then we'd better have good answers ready," Elias said, and looked out through the office window at the dry-docked shape of the Ardent Discipline S sister ships, still hanging in their gantry cradles, waiting on repairs from crews who now understood, better than any empire ever had, exactly what it meant to build something and stand behind it. If you've made it this far into humanity's most patient rebellion, you already know what happens when you underestimate the people holding the wrench. So if you want the next one, hit follow, and tell me in the comments what you think the Directorate's next mistake is going to be.